welcome to Brain Chat. I'm Dr. Mitzi Joy Williams, your board-certified neurologist and MS specialist, and my mission is to engage, educate, and empower those affected by MS to become an active part of their healthcare team. Here on Brain Chat, we'll be discussing all things MS, health and wellness, advocacy, and we'll even throw a little bit of music and music therapy in there as well. Thank you so much for joining us, and stay tuned for the next episode. All right. Well, welcome to Brain Chat. Happy Monday, everyone. My name is Dr. Mitzi Joy Williams. I'm your board-certified neurologist and MS specialist, and I am so excited to continue our discussion tonight about health equity. This is a really important discussion, and tonight we're going to be focusing a little bit more on clinical trials, which is a topic that's very near and dear to me in the work that I do, and I have some amazing super friends who are going to be on with me tonight to discuss this very topic. You know how we do on Brain Chat. If you're logging in, just log into the chat. Let us know where you are signing in from. I bid you greetings from Atlanta, where we're actually in real fall and out of fake fall, as we like to call it. And so very, very excited to talk to you guys tonight. So let's get into this discussion. So first, I'm going to introduce my amazing guests, and then we'll just get right into it. So first we have Sheila Thorne. And I'm so excited that Sheila's here with me tonight. I got to meet her doing a talk for another nonprofit focused on MS. But she is the president and CEO of Multicultural Healthcare Marketing Group. And so she is recognized as a leading expert in multicultural healthcare marketing. She spent nearly 3 decades designing and implementing health education, media, and marketing campaigns focused on communities of color. She's done a lot of work with pharma. She's worked with the top 50 pharmaceutical and biotech companies. And she also has done lectures, over 300 presentations, keynote speakers, and workshop leaders on diverse cultures, health disparities, health equity, and cultural competency. So extremely excited to have her here with us tonight. Welcome, Sheila.
Thank you, Dr. Williams. What a pleasure and an honor to see you again and be a part of this esteemed panel and conversation.
Awesome. And so next we have Courtney Billington, who is the president of Janssen Neuroscience and a member of the Janssen America's leadership team. He leads the neuroscience franchise and providing innovative treatments and services for patients with MS, as well as with psychiatric and neurological disorders. His team partners with research and development and other strategic functions to advance portfolio treatments, and it has a focus on schizophrenia and multiple sclerosis. He is an active member of many organizations designed to support leadership development and the advancement of people. All right, welcome, Courtney. So excited to have you with us tonight.
Thank you so much, Dr. Williams. It's an honor to be here and also to be with the other panelists and guests.
Awesome. And last but not least, we have Dr. Owen Garrick, who is the Chief Medical Officer of CVS Health Clinical Trial Services. In this role, he is responsible for the overall medical strategy across the portfolio, as well as overseeing medical compliance, clinical insights, publications, and clinical innovation. He will build out the medical affairs function, and he will also continue to be the executive sponsor for the CTS-wide equity efforts, including diversity in clinical trials. And I've had the pleasure of working with Owen on an inclusive research council for several years now. Welcome, Owen.
Thank you so much, Dr. Williams. An absolute pleasure.
Absolutely. All right. So we got a lot that we need to cover tonight. And I'm really excited to have you guys here with us. And so I just want to start every show by having you tell us a little bit about yourself and kind of how you got into this space. And we'll start with Sheila.
Well, it's quite interesting. When I think back almost 2 decades, Dr. Williams, I had no idea I'd be landing in this space in quite this way. I was definitely interested in healthcare as it affects communities of color. And clearly, when I would sit in rooms and listen to my colleagues about pharmaceutical companies and new products and new product development, they weren't talking to the people that had the disease. And so I felt there was something missing. I felt that there needed to be somebody to step in that space. And first, the conversation was all about health disparities. Now we have entered into a new arena with health equity. That's a very different dynamic. And so clearly, that really piqued my interest to say, how can people of African, Hispanic, Latino, Asian, and Native American descent be more included in clinical research? I mean, after all, it's the foundation for the practice of evidence-based medicine. If they're not in it, what are we doing?
Absolutely. I love that perspective, and I think you're so right in saying that we move the conversation from health equity. Many of the meetings that I used to go to in the beginning, we talk about what's the problem? What's the problem? What's the problem?
Right.
And now it's like, well, how do we come up with solutions?
How do we
All right,
fix it?
Courtney, tell us how you got into the space, or tell us about how you got into this field.
Well, so I think for me, it was a bit personal. Husband, father, youngest of 5 children, and my parents raised us with kind of these values of service. Remember my mom saying, to whom much is given, much is required, right? Like just telling us over and over as children. And then kind of I've tried to do that same thing with my own kids. But also too, I ended up, as a result of that, I ended up going to West Point, spent time in the Army, giving back to the country. And then further, it's what led me to join Johnson & Johnson. Values-based company, healthcare, helping others was something that I felt like I could continue to fulfill on that mission and vision. And then lastly, when I say it's personal, now that I'm with a company that focuses on creating a future where serious mental illness and debilitating neurological disorders are a thing of the past, I feel like I'm able to truly contribute in a different way. And, my father, who passed away with dementia, was something that was very, very close to me. And I realized that early on, there were certain signals that weren't addressed, that even being in this field, you find that stigma and other things with regards to access to care just aren't there. And I really dedicated myself to making a difference in that space.
I love it. I love it. Dr. Garrick.
Yeah, I, always wanted to be a doctor since I was a kid. I grew up in a predominantly Black neighborhood. And there, in terms of health, began to see, I didn't call it health equity or health disparities. It was really a focus on improving the health of the community and my family and friends. And I saw things like people dying at much younger ages than other communities. If you think about diabetes and peripheral vascular disease, folks losing toes and limbs, and you can grow up thinking that's the norm, because in some respects, in a microcosm it is. But, I was fortunate to see other communities where that wasn't the norm. And I always knew and felt there was something different and wrong, and that should be changed about that. And so I've built my career on making that impact, and, came to CVS Health about 1.5 years ago, to really build out, you look at CVS, a gigantic company, there's a CVS on pretty much every corner in the US, and the ability to scale and make an impact in healthcare is just a really phenomenal opportunity, and to be in a leadership position in particular where, you can help direct resources, develop the strategy, so people of color are not an afterthought, and really at the forefront of your thinking around improving healthcare in the U.S.
I love it. I love it. And much like many of your stories, I came to a point in my career where I was, touted as an expert in MS and African Americans. However, I kept feeling like I was getting new data, but it kept saying the same thing over and over again. People are doing worse, and we weren't really moving the needle. And so for me, it was more of a wake-up call, like, okay, so we've been talking about the problem. We know there's a problem, but what can I do, or how can I be an agent of change to try to raise awareness and to try to actually shift the outcomes and not just talk about how bad the outcomes are. And so very, very excited to get a little bit further into this conversation. So let's talk about clinical trials, right?
Mhm.
So I think clinical trials get a bad rep. I think clinical trials, when people think of clinical trials, they think of deep, dark basements and, Frankenstein devices and things like that. But clinical trials really are a tool that change the face of medicine, right? And how we come up with new treatments, right? And so one of the things that I try to stress to people is that, if everybody's not included in that process from the ground up, how do we know that everything works the same? How do we know, that there aren't subtle differences in side effect profiles or, things like that? But more importantly, it's access to very high quality care, right? You're getting, doctors, you're getting visits, you may be receiving some of your care for free. And so, aside from the fact of inclusiveness, it's really access to high quality care. So why is this increasing diversity in clinical trials? Why is it so important?
Dr. Williams, it's interesting you bring it up in terms of the need for it, because this is not new.
Right.
This has been something strongly encouraged for a very long time by the FDA, and yet nothing was really done to get your arms around it. People would say, oh, they're difficult to reach. It costs too much. It takes too long. And they put up these barriers. So the first thing I'd like to do is dispel yourself of the notion that we're hard to reach.
Right.
The key is we're hardly reached. Nobody asks us to be a part of these trials. And as a result, the participation is very minimal. And that's not a good thing. I mean, all the doctors I've worked with want to know that the drugs they prescribe, the regimens they prescribe, are safe and effective in everyone. And you can't do that unless you have everyone statistically significant in the trials. So it's not about race. It's about good science. That's how I feel about it.
Right. Any other thoughts? What about you, Owen?
You hit it right. Clinical trials is the only mechanism for us to bring new drugs and therapies to market, right? There's no around the way approach. You can't sidestep it. This is the path. And it's really around, you study a small group. And you want that small group to reflect the larger population, because you can say that the results from this small group actually apply to the larger population. So that's the importance of having people of color involved, because you want to make sure that these therapies actually work in them. Now, part of it's going to be genetic, and part of it's going to be environmental, right? And so there's lots of arguments as to if it's, is it 80-20 environmental versus genetic? And people can argue as much as they want, but at the end of the day, it's probably both. And you really do need all populations involved to make sure, to Sheila's point, that the drugs, these new therapies, impact and improve the lives and health of all populations. Now, folks can argue, well, I'm gonna just wait until the drug comes out, and then I'm gonna try it then. And that's true. And you are, in fact, still participating in the clinical trial because that drug actually works in you.
Right.
The beauty of participating early is that, for all the talk about how complex studies are, there's so much data collected, right? So it's not just if a drug works in a certain population, you can really begin to understand why and how you can improve the way it works. Or frankly, if there are just too many side effects, to withhold it from a certain population, and not based on race or ethnicity, but really based on biomarkers and biology, right? So the beauty of participating in the conduct of a clinical trial is that you have, frankly, all this money and resource spent to better understand the human condition. And so you, to Sheila's point, you're getting treated and you have greater access, and you also have a better understanding of human biology. And in this case, the biology of people of color.
Right. Yeah. And I think that's so important, right? Is that when, clinical trials are conducted, we're not just looking at the medication, but it really helps us to understand certain conditions and disease processes better. So, if we don't have that information, we don't have a good representation of the people who actually have the condition. And so
it can be dangerous. You're extrapolating data from white
Right.
middle-aged men and applying it because you don't have anything else. And that could be harmful, especially
Absolutely.
since many clinical trials are sometimes the last resort. It's a treatment option for
Mhm.
some therapeutic categories and some for
Right.
some people. So this is not this is serious business in terms of the quality of healthcare.
But
Absolutely.
and I would just add that I think we've certainly found that through science that many diseases affect people very differently. So, many of the factors that Sheila and Owen brought up, we realize that those diseases impact different populations in a different way. And then obviously also the medications that we then discover and develop through the trial process, if we don't have a good, diverse pool of candidates that we're doing these trials on, then you may not have accurate information on how best to treat someone with a particular disease. And then as a result of that, you may have different outcomes for certain populations.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. And so, we touched a little bit on some of the barriers, but I want to go back to what Sheila said, that we're often, or certain communities are not asked to be involved in research, right? So there's this perception. So I have lots of conversations, as I'm sure you all do, about diversity in clinical research. And the first thing that comes up is mistrust, right? Everybody's like mistrust, right? It certainly is an issue, right? There is a long, sordid history, of unethical experimentation, particularly in the Black community here in the US. But let's talk about the fact that there are people who want to be involved in clinical trials, but they're not asked, or they don't know where to find out about research if they're not being seen at a large academic center. I know that is a particular issue we have in the MS community. And we did a poll of people asking them about research, and they asked about Tuskegee, and most people didn't know what Tuskegee was.
Right.
And it's often just they're like, I don't know where to find out about it, or nobody ever asked me. So let's talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think you hit it on the head in terms of the historical abuses. I mean, they're definitely happened, they're there, and they're definitely cause for mistrust, distrust. But there's some contemporary mistrust and distrust going on too, with people who don't know about Tuskegee, but who have met with inequities and injustices in the healthcare system currently.
Right.
And so we've got to understand this is a continuum, and it hasn't stopped. So you've got to get over that barrier. And one of the ways I think we can do that is by partnering with the right groups in the community who can be a credible, trusted voice. And you can find them. I've had the pleasure of working with Owen on some programs like this, and they're there. You've got to go after them. And sometimes the sponsors aren't always aware of where these groups are and how to collaborate and develop partnerships with them. To me, that's the key to success.
Right.
You got to walk in the room with somebody who looks like you, somebody who can, look them in the eye, ask the hard questions. And unfortunately, COVID-19 has thrust all of this into the limelight because people saw people dying literally every day. And so their interest in clinical trials was piqued more than it has been in the past. So I'm optimistic. I know we can do this. And I certainly feel that if enough of us can say, here's best practices, these are promising practices, because every disease state is different. Every ethnic group is different. So you can't always approach them the same way. But you've got to get boots on the ground, feet on the street, community connections in order to dispel and mitigate that mistrust, distrust.
Absolutely.
And to Sheila's point, this notion of trust, you have to earn trust.
Exactly.
It's not just that something happened 80, 50, 30 years ago. It is the experience you have every single day going into an institution. And the experiences you hear that your friends and family are dealing with. And so as my role here at CVS, one of the things we think about is, how do we break that? A friend of mine calls it generational mistrust. And, one of our approaches is that it's not an afterthought. Right. So, we have locations in the community that we're converting to research sites. And the decision-making process was that, we had about 5 criteria. The top 2 criteria in terms of weighting were the first being ethnic diversity of the patients in that community. And then
Mhm.
the second being the economic diversity of those patients, right?
Mhm.
So when you start with, like I said, the patients in mind and the people within the community in mind, you begin, and people know when they're an afterthought,
Oh
right?
yeah.
They
Mm.
feel it, they see it, and it's not like you're intentionally treating them differently, but the experience is very different,
Oh
right?
yeah.
So if you can have convenient locations where it's easy to come in and out, and then you have the staff that looks like and reflects the communities you want to serve, folks get that you're serious about this and are willing to give you an opportunity to not just learn more about clinical trial participation, but actually to participate.
Mm.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
love it.
And
You know, and I think, interestingly enough, I've really been kind of thinking about, the way we conduct trials. And, as a scientist and a researcher, it's almost like we act like people are doing us a favor when really
Yeah.
they are
Yeah.
helping, we act like we're doing them a favor, but they're really helping us, And so I think that we really have to renovate the way that we think about trials to make them accessible, right? You really kind of have to be privileged to participate in a trial. You have to have time,
Mhm.
to spare off of work. You have to have transportation to get to the visits, childcare, right? Be able to miss your job. It is really kind of a burden on people to participate. And so I think that, as you were saying, Owen, thinking about making places convenient is extremely important. I think the other piece is also looking at who's doing the research, right?
Mhm.
We kind of go to the same places and are surprised when we get
Mhm.
the same results. And so, how do we look to invest in maybe investigators who may be of diverse backgrounds, who don't have all of the trappings of a big university, but have a population and a willingness, to participate and to learn? How do we really kind of renovate the way that we're currently conducting trials to make it more accessible and to make those involved more diverse?
Well, I think it comes from a commitment, right? The
Mhm.
organizations that are involved, whether it's, the trial sites or the original, inventors or manufacturers of the products, they have to be committed to wanting to do just what you said, Dr. Williams, of investing in different communities. They've got to want to make sure that their clinical trials are diverse and that they don't just stay with certain tried and true site organizations that they've worked with for years and years and
Mhm.
getting the same results from. So, we've done some things within Johnson and Johnson that we call our Raise to Health Equity. A couple of years ago, we made a $100 million commitment over a 5-year period to invest and promote greater health equity solutions. And I think part of what we've learned and pursue in those solutions are things that Owen mentioned. We're involving now patients before clinical trial design. We're asking them about the factors that you mentioned, transportation and other barriers, trying to understand what gets in the way so that we can actually provide solutions to those barriers before we even get into the trial, so that it doesn't become, well, this is the reason why we're only doing these trials in these set locations. And it frankly becomes an excuse for people to hide behind. And that's the sad reality. So I think
Mhm.
we need to be more committed to doing more, to delivering that diversity that we all want and know that we need.
Yeah, I'm glad you
Yeah.
used that word investment, Courtney. Most of
Put your money where your mouth is.
yeah, they look at this as a cost. It's an
Yeah,
investment. You
Mhm.
need
exactly.
you need to develop the market, and therefore, as Owen said, you build the trust, your credibility. You can't hit or miss. And Dr. Williams, location, location, location.
Mhm.
You use the same sites that are not in urban centers or hard to difficult to reach, costly to reach, and
Mhm.
you are not even lessening the burden. You're increasing the burden
Right.
in populations that are already overburdened with life stuff. So
Mhm.
how can you proactively reduce those burdens before they even ask you? So clearly, I think we've got to think creatively and
Mhm.
think within the cultural context of these communities.
Absolutely. And I think
this-
another thing that's interesting is that I was in a meeting one time and we were talking about diversity in trials, and I was talking about some of the data with MS, and someone, who's, an expert in our field stood up and was like, well, maybe they just can't find those patients, diverse patients. And it was like they lived in a huge city with plenty of diverse patients. And so I'm scratching my head like, what do you mean the patients are there? The patients are there, so even in some of our larger centers, there's no push or there's no incentive, right, to change your practice.
Exactly.
There's no consequences for not enrolling more diverse patients, but there's no incentive to either. And so we have to figure out how to, have that balance so that we're not necessarily, trying to entice people to reach certain quotas, but that we're really kind of giving it a fair chance to get people involved. I'm sorry, what were you going to say, Owen?
Yeah, I'm just going to add to your last point. There's also the issue that there's a real perception by a lot of researchers that people of color do not want to participate in research, right? This to this very day, like not a 10-year-old thing like today. And so, to your point, Mitzi, earlier around who is doing the research is important for a few reasons for that, because they know, that's not the case, right? And you have a natural network where you can identify those patients. And then, then the next phase is people like you might ask different research questions, right? So when you're connected to the community in MS or other neurodegenerative conditions, the biology of neurodegeneration makes sense, and you want to track that. But for many communities, really, the most important thing is quality of life. I was able to get up today, right? My MS didn't progress. I can still play softball, right? And so as you ask and design a research study to, in addition to measure the biology, but also to quantify and measure those quality of life things, because that is most relevant to the communities, that the patients that you're serving, you get different research.
Yeah.
Well, and oftentimes I think, there are past narratives. So as you mentioned about MS, right? The previous narrative of MS was, for a long time, it focused on MS is a disease that affects predominantly younger white women. And, frankly, as we look at the research shows that Black Americans are actually at a much higher risk of developing MS than what was ever previously thought. And even when they do develop it, you can have much more aggressive disease, severe symptoms, and faster progression. So, when you think about many things like that, it also leads to, if those narratives continue to be proliferated, then folks say, oh, we don't need that diversity, when in fact that narrative is not real.
Absolutely. So it really takes education, and I spend a great deal of time educating my colleagues, and sometimes I go door to door, and talking about it. And I'm very surprised that people are like, oh, I didn't know that, or wow, I never heard that, and so I think there's a lot of education that needs to be done. And so we've talked a little bit about some of the barriers. We talked about cost. We talked about not asking. We talked about the places where trials are conducted. And when we think about solutions, I kind of break things down into a couple of levels in my mind. So we think about the patient level, we think about the study level, and then we think about kind of the system level. One of the things that I try to emphasize is that a lot of times when we talk about lack of participation, it seems to kind of put the onus on the patient, like they don't want to participate, right? Versus recognizing that there are many larger barriers that may be preventing people from, participating, like, inclusion, exclusion criteria, where the studies are located. I want to kind of break down what are some solutions that we can look at each level. Sheila, I'd like for you to start with, what are some of the solutions at the patient level?
Yeah, that's a very important part of it, because that's the opportunity of listening to the patient voice to find out exactly why they are reluctant and resistant to participating. Is it the mistrust, distrust, which certainly could be a part of it, but they're usually life stuff. I mean, we all have heard in the last decade, social determinants of health, okay, where we live, work, play, and pray. If those pieces are not in play, so that patient finds it easy to add this to their responsibility, that becomes daunting. And Courtney and Owen mentioned transportation, childcare, education, access, what kind of insurance, your job, all of those things will probably, if I can't figure out how to make that work, I'm not going to volunteer. I'm not going to tell you that. I just will opt out. So we have to proactively upstream figure out where this might be a problem and how we can mitigate that, whether it's providing funds for transportation, whether it's somehow facilitating health care, child care or elder care, because many of these families have multiple generations in the same house. So we really have to get into the mindset. So I think across the board, there's a cultural deficit as to what really is important for these groups and why they might hesitate. And it has nothing to do with their willingness. It has more to do with dealing with just life. And I'll have to say, full disclosure, I really want to know what's life going to be like if I volunteer for this trial.
Right.
The day-to-day basis. You know, I may have 4 to 6 weeks of diagnostic tests. What's going to happen during that time? And what after the end of that, I'm not eligible? You know, so, I mean, we've got to help patients know, here's what it's like. Here's how we can support you in lessening the burden. But tell them the truth, the good, the bad, and the ugly.
Absolutely.
So they can make an informed decision.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And Owen, I'd like for you to talk a little bit about reform at, let's say, the study level, you know, how we conduct the trials, and talk a little bit about decentralized trials.
Sure. Yeah, this notion of decentralized trials is, you know, very broadly getting trials out of these academic medical centers and into, you know, the community. So they're centralized in, you know, the big institutions, and you are decentralizing them by moving them into community. And the benefit of that is, and we've touched on this, one, convenience. And then two, you have these different, what I'll call locus of control, right? So usually in a centralized fashion, it's one entity. In the decentralized community fashion, you are creating solutions very specific to that very small geography. That could be a 20-block radius. And as we've seen, especially with COVID, different communities needed different solutions at different parts of the pandemic. And that's not, you know, dissimilar from clinical trials. You know, as an example, we've touched on transportation. We had a huge issue with one of our studies earlier in the year. There was a huge no-show rate. Folks would sign up to participate, then wouldn't show up. And this is after we had locations very convenient. So we added a ride share, you know, using Uber. And patients can come to and from the center on our dime. And there was a 21 percentage point decrease in that, right? And so that was in the Atlanta area. And so we decided to have that across all of our studies. And interestingly, it didn't work as well in the Philly, New Jersey area, because we have a site located in Jersey. And you have about 5 minutes away from Philly, but you have to take a bridge. And mentally, just getting on a bridge, it's like, oh, that's just way too far. Literally, it is no further than, you know, something that is, you know, 10 blocks away. So that local focus is really, really important when we think about centralized trials, because what a solution that works just fine in one community might need to be tweaked as we look to serve a different community. And to Sheila's point, and the other point, and it's like, if you have the assumption and mindset that these patients, we owe them because they are volunteering their time, and we should make it as easy as possible for them to participate. And you didn't ask me this, but we should also thank them, right? I mean, we just shockingly don't thank patients enough for participating in research. So I'll pause there to have maybe others chime in, but really that hyper local focus is one of the things to think about much.
Yeah, and I really like what you said about kind of tailoring the solutions to different areas. It's not a one size fits all. And
No,
not only should we thank them, we should let them know what happened to their data, right? We just take
exactly.
their blood and do all this stuff and then publish it in a journal and they never hear about it again.
Right. That's right.
I frequently had patients come in, and say, I participated in this trial, whatever happened. And so we got to
Mhm.
go look it up on PubMed to see what happened, because there's no communication back to
And
them. And
and I
go
think
ahead.
that speaks to this point that patients really want to know. They have a
You
thirst
do.
for
Mhm.
knowledge. People of color aren't trying. They don't want to be. They're not. You know, they don't want to be uninformed. They truly have a thirst to learn more. To Sheila's point, tell
Mhm.
them the good, bad, and the ugly, and they will
Yeah,
make the right decision.
They will.
absolutely.
Because they value being respected, and they value being provided all the information,
Mhm.
um, and they want to learn about what happened. Did the drug work or not work, and why not?
Mhm.
Absolutely.
Mhm.
Absolutely. And that's a big driving force, right? People want to know that they're helping the community, that they're helping
Yes.
people that look like them. And so when they don't get that feedback, they don't know if they helped or not. So how
Mhm.
would that, encourage them? That would probably discourage you not to do it again, if it were a possibility. And so what about the sponsor level, Courtney? Tell us a little bit about solutions at the sponsor or system level.
Yeah, I think first it comes with making sure that we understand the true population makeup
Hmm.
of a disease. So that narrative example that I gave is one. Also, now the good thing is, some of our regulators, like the US FDA, has recently issued guidance
Hmm.
to sponsor organizations like ours of medical products, where we're required now to develop and submit a race and ethnicity diversity plan.
Mhm.
Hmm.
And that has to be done early in the clinical development phase of a medicine. And so
Mhm.
companies now are required to work to incorporate this guidance into their standard operating practices and procedures and make sure that they outline processes for establishing more diverse clinical trials. And we've worked to do that on our own policies within Johnson and Johnson.
Yeah, and I think, it goes back to what Owen said about, or maybe Sheila, about making sure it's not an afterthought. So,
Yeah. Yeah.
we have a trial that we're running for MS called the CHIMES trial. It's the first one focused on Black and Hispanic people with MS.
Mhm.
Very exciting. We enrolled ahead of time, over enrolled by 25%, all Black
Mhm.
and Hispanic people in the middle of a pandemic, right?
Wow. Wow.
And so, in that regard, it's a success story. But at the same time, we don't want to have to do these trials after the fact, right?
Right.
Our
Right.
goal is to have people in the trials from the beginning so that we don't have to go back and do additional trials because there were so few people in the original clinical trials.
Exactly.
Yeah. And so, with that in mind, I know we're getting a little bit close to the end of our time. Um, Tell me about initiatives or projects that you all are excited about in the space. Like, I get so excited when I talk about this because I see so much movement in such a short period of time, and I'm very excited about many of the initiatives that are going on and things that are really making a difference. So tell us one or two things that each of you are excited about, or projects you're excited about that you're working on, or other things you're involved in the space. We'll start with Sheila.
Yeah, I think when companies like Janssen make a commitment, that gives me hope that the message is getting to the top level where the money decisions are made and the strategy decisions are made, because that's where it needs to be. I'm currently working on some mental health trials, which are very challenging in our community because of the stigma attached to that.
Mm-hmm.
Working on an epilepsy trial that's in your space.
Mm-hmm.
Dr. Williams, I'm going to have to call you about that too. So,
Call me up.
short of cloning you, okay, we need to get more, because obviously there aren't that many folks in this space, and certainly not like you. But we're very excited about the opportunity to make these two areas good. And we're starting with community mapping. Where are the sites? Who's the PI? What's the
Mm-hmm.
clinical site team look like?
Mm-hmm.
Can we help that group in terms of making sure that when I come in for my visit, if I'm using the traditional method, I can feel welcome, I can feel included. So it goes at every level. And don't get me started about IRBs, okay? Because they're a necessary component, but often inclusion exclusion criteria, do they have to be so stringent? Where are you going to find these Black people with all of this exclusion criteria? So from a scientific perspective, I get it. The outcomes have to be scientifically significant, and you have to reach your endpoints. But let's take a look at that and see whether or not we're being overly complicated about that. So I'm excited about both these trials we're working on. It's on anxiety, irritability, and clinical depression and epilepsy. So these are not normally talked about in our community.
Right.
So to your point, massive education has to happen in terms of not only the trial, but the disease state. What does it mean? Because as soon as you say mental health with people of color, I'm not crazy. So, so we have to really uncover some of the barriers that have been passed on by generation that are just not true. So my team is excited. I mean, I left the agency world to set up my own shop with all people who look like me so that we can focus on this.
Absolutely.
That's what we've been doing successfully, because we do give back. We're paying back and paying it forward.
I love it. And there's a question actually that's relevant, or a comment in the chat that's relevant to what you're saying, Sheila. And it was someone who said, that they've tried to volunteer for numerous trials, but they don't fit the criteria. And so they never get accepted. And so this is certainly an issue that needs to be addressed, particularly in our MS trials. Often people are too disabled to be in the trials, or, the criteria for diabetes or hypertension is so stringent that people can't be involved. So we have to kind of look at the whole process and see how we can, still maintain good science, but make it more acceptable. Because either we're going to experiment in the trial, or we're going to be experimenting in the real world with all these people with these conditions that weren't in the trial.
And the MS patients I had the pleasure of meeting when I worked with you, Mitzi, kept telling me about their visits to emergency rooms where they were dismissed. They were not listened to. Their events or whatever they were going through, their crises, was looked at, oh, you're just hypersensitive, or you're just overreacting. So we've got to train our healthcare professionals to listen to the patient voice and not let cultural biases impact that decision.
Absolutely. All right.
So,
Owen. Courtney, tell us what you're excited about.
Yeah, because, as I'm sitting here listening to Sheila, I'm getting all excited about a program that we have called Research Includes Me. And essentially what this program is built around is providing clinical information on clinical research to communities that have been historically underrepresented in clinical studies. And what we do is we share information about the clinical research process, why diverse participation is so important. We do things with partners who are very trusted as we provide that education and share that information. And then we give an overview of the overall process and get feedback so that we can, in real time, ensure that the research that we are doing meets the needs of the population we're trying to research. So it's something that we're hugely excited about. We've got websites and other tools to make it more accessible for people to get to it. And then, like I said, we're going into communities where the people are to make sure we get their feedback as well.
Amazing. Owen?
Yeah, one of the things we're really excited about here at CVS is what we call our commitment on diversity and equity. And there are really two components to that. One is internal and the other is external. Internally, we've made a commitment to recruit at least 30,000 diverse subjects into studies over the next 5 years. And, that's, to me, the reason I came here, the ability to do something like that at scale. And one of the things we've realized is there are lots of things you have to have in place in order to reach that goal. But you really do have to have equity as part of your DNA and part of your strategy. And I mentioned, our site location. The other component, I mentioned the staff, the research staff reflecting the community. And in particular, we have a target of 10% of our PIs and our principal investigator network to be diverse. That might not seem like a big number, but if you realize that 2% of all PIs and FDA studies are from underrepresented communities. Our target of 10 is 5 times that number. Right? And we realize in order to get to this 30,000 number, we really have to be super focused and frankly put our resources, this notion of putting your money where your mouth is not just the money, but frankly having your best people. This is part of your core strategy. The second thing, as I mentioned, externally focused. We are building something we're calling a diversity partner network. And this is, old school, working with community-based organizations here. What I think we are doing, it's not really rocket science, but it's a little different, is we are compensating these organizations for their time and their effort. And usually we go to community-based organizations and expect them to do things for free. Right. And we pay people, we pay people to answer phone calls, send out letters, right? Open letters. And, so we should really be compensating our community-based partners. So we're having, we have the ability to reach people that are CVS patients, but also the ability with this diversity partner network to get to those trusted voices and help build education and awareness programs around clinical trial participation without an ask initially, right? But then eventually, introducing and leveraging the community-based organizations to be those trusted voices to the messenger, to introduce them to people to participate or opportunities to participate in clinical trial. So we call it CODE, our commitment on diversity and equity, and it's really integrating it into everything we do and then supplementing that with folks in the community that really know how to reach people throughout the country.
Well, listen, I am excited. Listening to all of the amazing things that you all are involved in has really got me excited about the future, excited about us really moving the needle in this space. And I am so grateful for you all being so gracious with your time with us today to talk about this extremely important topic. And I guess the thing I'm excited about is the Joy Life Foundation, which my husband and I opened earlier this year. And our focus is on increasing diversity in neuroscience, right? Because one of the other pieces is that we do have to increase the diversity within the workforce. So we need to reach those, who are already in the fields, that are underrepresented minorities. But we also have to let people know, that, things like neuroscience are a viable career, and they see other people who look like them doing the work and doing this amazing work, and they know that they can do it too. So I'm very excited about that. Well, thank everyone for joining us on Brain Chat tonight. Thank you for those of you who tuned in, and we will see you again in